Hello, Wake Up New Zealand. As promised, I'm going to tell you more about co-governance in New Zealand. So this is from my perspective, from the research that I have done and ignoring what everyone else has said. Excuse me. Well, we'll start off with 1971. Prior to 1971, the Indian Canadian Brotherhood. President of the Indian Canadian Brotherhood was a man named Andrew Paul, Paull. Well, he passed away, and his friend, George Manuel, took over the presidency of the Indian Canadian Brotherhood. And that was this George Manuel that established the World Council of Indigenous People. Well, the World Council of Indigenous People, when they first gave their speech in the UN in New York, 100 Native protesters walked out because they had never heard of this being called Indigenous, and they had not given their consent to be called Indigenous. So they walked out in protest. So moving on, George Manuel of the Indian Canadian Brotherhood, with a Canadian delegation, came to New Zealand in 1971. And they were taken around, they saw different Maori entertainment and what have you. You know what you do when you do the tourist thing. They did that. And then George Manuel invited Maori politicians, certain Maori politicians, and certain Maori entertainers back to his motel room to talk to them seriously about being labelled as Indigenous people. So what does all this mean? I mean, George Manuel is the father of UNDRIP, the co-governance. So it took 10 years for this co-governance, this UNDRIP, to be planned and introduced, adopted in the UN in 2007. And during that 10 years prior, the planning of that, we had certain Iwi Elite that were actually conversing, communicating, collaborating on this UNDRIP. So in 2007, when it was first adopted into the UN, New Zealand rejected the UNDRIP. So why did they reject a co-governance? And what has happened since? And what does that mean? Why did they reject it? So, first of all, it was non-compliant with the Treaty or Waitangi. It meant two classes of citizenship. It was non-compliant with the law of New Zealand and our constitution. And what it also meant that all this land, the entire country of New Zealand, would be controlled by Indigenous peoples. So the reason around that, why it was rejected, is because already there were New Zealanders, whether they were married, non-married, that already legally owned land. They had property rights, and it would be impossible to actually make it so that all iwi Maori owned everything. And then we had natural resources. This also came under the UNDRIP. So what it meant to actually be on that side of the table of co-governance and going along with the UNDRIP is that Iwi Elite would control all natural resources in New Zealand. This is all part of the UNDRIP. This is your vision. This is Vision 2050. This is Vision 2040. This is UN Agenda 2030 being enacted out in New Zealand. This is the fourth industrial revolution being acted out in New Zealand. So looking at Vision 2050, the pathway for New Zealand, Vision 2050, what it actually documents and says that feminism will be the leadership in New Zealand, that patriarchal will be targeted, and the Indigenous Iwi Elite will enact out the plan. And this is exactly where it's at. So we had the Agenda 2030 international meeting with accelerating it that was supposed to happen in Parliament yesterday, that didn't. They went virtual because they said that the freedoms movement, Brian Tamaki, and all those families and what have you who went there, well, they had to bring extra policing in from around the country because of the violence. I have never seen one march of Brian Tamaki's that had been violent. I've been in all the marches. There would be very few that I've missed out on. Even when Brian Tamaki walked down on the motorway that time, the police were standing there showing us all the way to go that way onto the motorway. They were showing us. That's what they did. So, people, the police are there to serve the parliamentarians. They're not there to serve us. And the other thing is, yes, let's mention the World Economic Forum that none of these politicians want to talk about. I think it's rather strange that for, 3 years in a row, that the WEF actually assessed all policing across the world. So the lowest assessment was 1, highest 7. It's doing very well. New Zealand got 6.2, 6.4, 6.4 out of 7 high. And all you hear when Ardern was leader, and I still think she's leader of this country. Hipkins is just her puppet. He was visiting Tony Blair years ago, which is in Ardern. So what you've got all these parties on the same page, because not one of them are talking about this. Not one of them are talking about mass migration. Not one of them talking about that in 2018, when I opposed the UN Global Compact on Migration and put my 70-page submission into Parliament, not Peters did this. He did not tell you about the Mayor's Migration Council, the Mayor's Migration Declaration that would be played out worldwide through local governments and mayors, the mass migration to dilute sovereign nations, where our children are taught to be good global citizens, never mind being good Kiwis, be good global citizens. If none of these politicians, political cronies in the Hospital of Wellington, none of them are talking about it. So that is it. They are all on the same page. It doesn't matter what any of them say. They can say what they like. They're all on the same page. They are not talking about what I talk about in my research. So wake up, New Zealand. I mean, it's time to come together as a nation. We need to change this. We need leaders who are going to think about people, act for people. We do not need the dark side of politics. It's dark. And for goodness sake, and I'll say it again, it doesn't matter if you're Hannah Tamaki, whether you're Brian Tamaki, whether you're Counterspin, whether you're Damien Demand, whether you're Vinnie Eastwood, whether you're me. It doesn't matter if you're Liz Gunn. You're all targeted because you're speaking out the truth about what's happening. Every one of you. How can you all be so divided? If anything pisses me off, that does. Because what you've done is you've bought in to this mainstream media character assassination of each and every one of you. You know, I hear things about Liz Gunn and I go, shameful to actually do that, to actually speak so nastily about Liz Gunn, to speak so nastily about Hannah and Brian Tamaki, to speak so nastily about Counterspin and Damien Demand. And what about Vinnie Eastwood? You know, the people who get arrested and they've been targeted. And I just can't get over it. Why the infighting? Why calling different people cultists and, oh, they're just looking after themselves? Oh, for goodness sake, grow up, grow a pair of balls. I have to say this because if anything infuriates me more is the division when we're all saying the same thing. I would like to see all the freedom fighters, all the leaders for the freedom fighters get into Parliament. I want them all to have seats. The more, the better. We have to stop this. It said something when Wellington's sister city is Beijing. And today is Chinese Language Week. And we do not even have a universal English language week. Our kids are being dumbed down, they're being sexualized, sexually groomed. And police officers, they want all these recruits. They can't get recruits. The police don't want, these young people don't want to be police recruits anymore. They see what's happening. And that's been well documented. And it's happening right across the world. So wake up, New Zealand. Let's get our shit together and start waking up and doing something about it. Look, time is running short. Stop fighting each other. Just get on with it. Do the freaking job and get that lot, clear the swamp. Drain the swamp out of Parliament. Get rid of them all. Wake up.